Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. This is a podcast where we mispronounce French words and we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I really love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. For those who are supporting the podcast via Patreon, my patrons out there, thank you guys so much. If you're listening and you would like to support this podcast, please consider becoming a Patreon patron. You can find the link in the description wherever you're listening or watching this video. That would be huge. The more patrons I get, the more time I can spend on this podcast and justify spending time on this podcast. Another way to support the podcast is to become a subscriber on YouTube. You can turn on the notification bell there to get all the new episodes. I usually do about 2 a week. And then third way is to go to Apple Podcasts and leave me a 5-star review and a comment. That would be huge. Today's episode is very special, like all of them, but this one's, I don't know how to say it. It's very, very, very special because I have with me Dr. Quassim Cassam, and we're talking about one of his books. Is one of my favorites. It's called The Possibility of Knowledge. And it goes over how possible questions, actually the how possible question of knowledge. How is knowledge possible? We're going to be talking a little bit about transcendental arguments and then Dr. Kassam's unique approach to various problems in epistemology. So without further ado, let's bring him in. Dr. Kassam, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here, Parker.
Yeah, so as I was saying off screen and as we've been talking in email, I'm so appreciative of you taking the time to talk about this work. I think you said it was like 15 years ago, like 2006 or something like that when it was first published. And then
yeah, it's published in 2006, but I was working on it kind of before that, so it's actually really a very long time since I last thought about this stuff. But no doubt you're going to refresh my memory.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's one of my favorites because I love transcendental arguments, and as you said in the book, I believe the book started as an exercise in transcendental epistemology, and then kind of changed. Do you remember how that happened?
Yeah, so just to go a bit further back, so when I was a grad student in Oxford, I was supervised by a guy called Peter Strawson.
Okay.
So Peter Strawson is one of the great figures of 20th century British philosophy,
Yeah.
and very much associated with this particular style of argumentation called transcendental arguments. And he uses transcendental arguments in his own philosophy. And in fact, it was reading Strawson's work that not only turned me on to transcendental arguments, but actually turned me on to philosophy in the first place.
Wow.
So it was a really huge deal to have him as my advisor. And my early work was continued to develop these arguments in his sort of tradition. But by the time I started to think about the possibility of knowledge, I started to become a little bit more skeptical about these arguments. I started to feel that, maybe they didn't really answer the question that lots of people thought they were supposed to answer. And I mean, I wasn't the first. I mean, there's a very famous article by an American philosopher called Barry Stroud, published in the 1960s, in which he attacks transcendental arguments. My take is sort of somewhat different from his, but I came around to thinking that, maybe this isn't, in the end, the most convincing way of doing philosophy, even though it's massively influential.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to get back to Barry Stroud in a little bit and some more on transcendental arguments, but maybe as we set up this conversation, can you account for us like how questions and how possible questions and maybe what's the difference between the two?
Yeah. So here's an example, right? So supposing I ask you, how do you make beef Wellington? Right now, that's a request for a recipe fundamentally, or a request for a technique, right? So there's something that I want to do, and I want to know how to do it. Or I could ask you, how do I get from London to Paris? So again, a question about how you do something. What are the means by which you do something? But now, supposing I ask the question, how is it possible to make beef Wellington? Right? Now, that sounds like that's a kind of weird question, right? But I mean, the implication there seems to be that there's something problematic or difficult about making beef Wellington, something that makes it look as though it shouldn't be possible to do it.
Yeah.
So if you go to a Michelin star restaurant and you're eating this unbelievably elaborate dish, you look at it and you just obviously someone made it, but if you say, well, how is it possible to do something like this? The implication is that it's this is something difficult. There are obvious obstacles in the way of doing this. So that, I think, is the kind of general idea. So how possible questions are, as I call them, obstacle dependent.
Mm.
So when you say, how is such and such a thing possible, you're implying that there's an obstacle that makes it look as though it wouldn't be possible or shouldn't be possible. And then you're asking, how, nevertheless, is it possible?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the obstacle dependence there. That's really helpful. Uh, okay, so there's a famous, problem of the criterion with from Chisholm, and he goes over Methodism and particularism, and this is just a random one that I've been thinking about. But in my mind, if someone's asking a how possible question, they're coming from like a particularist standpoint. They're saying it's not. It's not like that it's possible, but how is it possible given that we have this knowledge, given that we have this thing? Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, maybe it's helpful to think about the kind of historical origins of this sort of
Yeah,
question, right?
sure.
So how possible questions are associated with Immanuel Kant, right?
Hmm.
So in the Critique of Pure Reason, published in the 18th century, he asks a whole series of how possible questions. So examples of how possible questions that Kant asks are, how is mathematics possible? How is natural science possible? How is metaphysics possible? So let's take the mathematical case
Yeah.
as an example. Now, when Kant asks, how is mathematics or mathematical knowledge possible? Of course, he's assuming that it is possible, right?
Right.
Because he's assuming that, math exists, that there are mathematical truths and that we know some of them. But he also has a certain view about the nature of mathematical knowledge, which makes it really hard to see how human beings could have it.
Right.
That's the basic problem. So he thinks that mathematical knowledge is what he calls synthetic a priori.
Hmm.
Right. Now, we don't need to get too much into the details of that, but synthetic a priori knowledge is a kind of weird sort of knowledge,
Because
and it's
because
not
because
obvious.
mathematical knowledge is it's necessarily true, but it's not like true by definition. It's not a
True by
priori.
definition. Exactly,
Yeah.
right. So his thought is that it's synthetic, meaning it's not a definitional or conceptual or analytic truth. It's not like saying all Baptists are unmarried men, which you
Right.
can come to know just by analyzing the concepts. So he thought the internal angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees, which he thought was true. That's not something that you can come to know just by conceptual analysis. So that's why he thought it was synthetic. But he also thought that mathematical um, uh, truths were necessary truths that you could come to know independently of sense experience. So
Hmm.
that's what he meant when he said that they're a priori. So his concern was, well, this seems really strange, right? Because if somebody asked me, well, how do you know there's a computer screen in front of you? Well, by using my senses, right? So
Yeah.
so my knowledge that there's a computer screen in front of me, that's empirical knowledge, not a priori knowledge. How do I know that all Baptists are unmarried men? Just by analyzing the concepts.
Right.
But now you have a kind of knowledge that you can't acquire by conceptual analysis, but you also can't acquire by using your senses. So how on earth is such a thing possible? Because that was the problem. That was the problem. So Kant assumed that mathematical knowledge is synthetic a priori.
Hmm.
He assumed that synthetic a priori knowledge is not a kind of knowledge that is easily or obviously available to human beings.
Hmm.
And then that generates the question, right? Well, given the obstacles to synthetic a priori knowledge, how is such knowledge possible for us?
Yeah.
That's the how. That's the how possible question.
Yeah.
And then that sort of generalizes. So my thought when I wrote that book was that well, he's onto something here, which is that um, for any given kind of knowledge, whether it's synthetic a priori knowledge or even ordinary sensory knowledge, philosophers have traditionally thought there are obstacles that stand in the way of our acquiring these types of knowledge. That's the problem of skepticism
Right.
fundamentally. Right. So skeptics say you can't have these types of knowledge, and then you or I might say, well, yes, we can. But then the skeptic is going to come back and say, all right, well, tell me how such a thing is possible, given the obstacles that I've identified.
Yeah. Well, and that's really helpful. I also noticed you went. So many of the people who I read focus on Kant's transcendental deductions, and then they try to say, well, that's transcendental arguments, and they go with Peter Strawson, who tried to repersonate them. And I thought it was really interesting that you found your multi levels approach in Kant himself, and you said not as many people have focused on Kant's how possible questions. For whatever reason, we latched on the transcendental deductions, but I thought
Yeah.
that was so interesting that this is a constructive work, but it's also you're drawing out something historical from Kant himself from the first critique. I thought that was fantastic.
Well, thanks. I mean, I remember being very struck actually when I first started to work on that book by the fact that on the one hand, here you have one of the great works of Western philosophy,
Yeah.
the Critique of Pure Reason, which is organized around a series of how possible questions. I mean, in the introduction to the critique, Kant lists a whole bunch of how possible questions, and
Hmm.
he's clearly exercised by these questions. And an enormous amount has been written about the Critique of Pure Reason, but very little at that time had been written about the nature of how possible questions. I was really quite surprised about that. People talked about all sorts of other methodological issues in Kant, the nature of transcendental arguments, the nature of transcendental deduction, or transcendental proof, and so on and so forth. But very few people had actually focused directly on how possible questions. I mean, an example of a philosopher who did say something useful about them, though briefly, was Robert Nozick.
Yeah.
He had a bit to say about them. John McDowell had a bit to say about how possible questions. And a philosopher of history called William Dray talked about how possible questions. But they were the only three sources that I could find.
Yeah.
And that just struck me as odd. Why hadn't people really thought about these questions in their own right and in relation to Kant? So that's really what I was trying to do in the book.
Yeah. So you develop instead of transcendental argument or deduction, whatever we want to call it, you come up with this multi levels approach, which you do find in Kant, which I thought was fantastic. But level one is means, level two is obstacle removal, and then level three is identifying enabling conditions, and we can talk about those. But for Kant, at least when it comes to mathematics, I believe he took a level one response, and he said. We're going to find a mean. So it's not just our reason and our sense perception, but there's a third way that you're missing, and it's I don't really fully get it, but construction in pure imagination, is that right?
Yeah. So when Kant thought about, so let's just say geometry as the example, right? So when
Okay.
Kant talked about geometry, I mean, Kant's conception of geometry was basically Euclidean. Now, obviously, geometry has moved on since Euclid's time, since Kant's time.
Mhm.
But the key Euclidean insight that Kant was really exercised by was the fact that geometrical proof in Euclid involves the use of diagrams,
Mhm.
right? So what you do in Euclidean proofs is that you literally draw a triangle and then
Yeah.
manipulate the image in various ways to prove that this angle plus this angle plus this angle is equal to this angle plus this angle plus that angle. Right? So that's how Euclidean proofs work. And you can draw these diagrams, Kant thought, either on paper or on a whiteboard, if they had such things in his
Yeah.
day, or you can do it in the imagination. And so he thought, well, now this is really interesting, right? So supposing you carry out these proofs in the imagination, so that's what Kant called pure intuition, right? So you
Mhm.
imagine a triangle and you imagine performing various operations on this triangle. Right? And so his question was, well, but how does that tell us anything about the geometry of the physical world?
Right.
How do you make the leap, the transition from um, what you might call the geometry of imaginative space to the geometry of physical space?
Mhm.
And so, doing these Kantian constructions, you're sort of learning something about, as it were, the geometry of the human mind, the
Yeah.
geometry of what figures human beings can construct. Um, uh, but you're drawing conclusions from that about the geometry of physical space. So how is that possible? How can you make that transition? And Kant had a kind of astonishing answer to that question, right? And the answer was idealism, right? So it's only because the physical world is in some sense dependent on the human mind that
Mhm.
learning about the human mind is a way of learning about the physical world,
Yeah.
right? Now, I mean that's an incredible, it's a dazzling insight. I mean, I don't believe it, of course, but I don't think it's true that the physical world is dependent on the human mind. But it's a really cool way of addressing, this problem. Right? He couldn't see any other way that we could have this special insight that we have into the geometry of physical space using the techniques that geometers since Euclid have actually used.
Yeah.
And so here you see lots of different elements of Kant's philosophy coming together. His philosophy of mathematics, his theory of how possible questions, and ultimately his metaphysical theory. Right? I mean, the particular version of idealism that he
Yeah.
that he endorsed.
Transcendental idealism, as people have called it since then.
Transcendental.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a label. Transcendental idealism. Right.
Yeah. So we don't have to spend too much more time on Kant, but I know some people have tried to hit him on this point that transcendental idealism, if you're just doing construction in pure imagination, why would my triangle be the same as yours, Dr. Kassam? Like, what's there's no like pre-formation theory or anything like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So again, this is very interesting. So Kant is certainly interested in, as it were, the human mind and the structure of the human mind.
Mhm.
But he's not particularly interested in the difference between one human mind and another human mind,
Yeah.
right? I think he takes it that all human beings, in virtue of human beings, have the same basic kind of cognitive structure.
Mhm.
And one of the things he's doing in his philosophy is investigating the structure of the human mind.
Yeah.
And it's very striking if you wind the philosophical clock forward to to the present day. I mean, one thing that philosophers today, maybe even ordinary people, think about sometimes is how can you be sure that other minds
Yeah.
are similar to yours, or how do you know that there are minds apart from your own mind? And it's very striking that this problem of other minds, which is now a sort of epistemology 101 problem, just doesn't figure in Kant's philosophy at all. Right? There
Yeah.
is no problem of other human minds for Kant. I mean, there is a problem about what if anything can we know about the mind of God, for
Yeah.
example,
Mhm.
and that that and of course he thinks that we can't understand what the mind of God would be like, except that it's going to be very different from ours. So there's that,
Yeah.
there's that in Kant. But yeah, so your point about, well, you know, how can we be sure that your imagination is like my imagination? I mean, Kant's answer to that would be, well, you're both human beings, aren't you?
Yeah. That makes sense. Okay. So getting back to the multi-levels approach, you say, and I think I'm probably paraphrasing here, but a good answer to how possible questions will identify a means by which a particular kind of knowledge is possible, a means response. It will remove obstacles to the acquisition of knowledge by the proposed means, and that's through either obstacle dissipating or obstacle overcoming, and it will identify the enabling conditions for knowing by the proposed means. So means really is important, and it ought to be number one. Uh, I wonder if we can lay this out further by considering other minds and your answer to the problem of other minds.
Mm, mm. So supposing the question is, how is it possible for me to know what any other person is thinking
Mhm.
or feeling? How is that possible? Um, so if it's a how possible question, there must be an obstacle that generates the question.
Mhm.
Okay, so the obstacle is kind of fairly obvious, right? I mean, the natural thought is that, look, people's thoughts and feelings and desires and emotions are beneath the surfaces that we can see, right? So
Yeah.
I can see your physical body, I can see your face, I can see your facial expressions, so, but what you're thinking right now. What do you think of this interview as we're doing it?
Hmm.
I mean, for me, well, I don't have any direct insight into that. Right. So the problem of other minds then is how can we ever overcome this apparent barrier to our knowledge of minds other than our own?
Yeah.
The hiddenness of other people's mental states. So to answer that question, I mean, you need to identify a means of knowing the mind of another person. Right
Mhm.
now, I mean, there may be a whole lot of different means that um, can be thought of. So in the book, I talk about perception as a possible source of other minds. So the thought is that, well, sometimes you can just see that someone else is angry or see that they're depressed. Right? So that would be one possibility. Or you might think of something like empathy as a source of
Yeah.
knowledge of other minds, right? Or no doubt there are lots of other possibilities.
Mhm.
So there you have the means, and then for each of these means, you're going to have to show how these means overcome the obstacles to knowledge of other minds, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, so the challenge for someone who says, well, you can just perceive someone else's mind, is to say, well, how does that overcome the obstacle that their inner states are really inner, right?
Right.
That
Or
sure,
deception or something, right? Like
yeah,
I could make it
exactly,
look like I'm enjoying this, but inside
exactly,
I'm
yeah.
terrified or hating it or yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so I only perceive your surfaces, your outer surfaces, and maybe there's nothing in there at all, right? Or maybe what's going on in there is very different from what I believe. So that's one sort of problem for the perceptual approach. If you think about empathy, so empathy is where I sort of use my imagination to get into your head.
Yeah.
Well, how do I do that? Right? How do I know that what I'm imagining is really what's going on? Right. So those are some of the obstacles that need to be dealt with, and you can deal with an obstacle in two different ways. Either you can deal with it by saying, look, the thing that you think is an obstacle just isn't an obstacle.
Yeah.
Right? So you might say, well, it's actually not true that your inner life is really inner, right? That it's not true that your states of mind are not visible on your outer surfaces,
And
right?
this would dissipate the obstacle, right?
This would be
Dissipating.
an obstacle. Yeah. So this would be the view of someone who says what really causes the problem of other minds is this picture of the inner and the outer as separate domains,
Yeah.
but that when you think of them as interpenetrating, so this is something that lots of, I think, Wittgenstein inspired philosophers believe. If you
Mhm.
think of them as interpenetrating, then the problem just shouldn't be posed or can't be posed in the way that philosophers have traditionally posed it.
And that's
That would be
is that his
one.
private language argument? The
That would
beetle in
be
the
a that.
box?
Yeah, I mean, it would be a sort of application of the
Okay.
private language argument.
Yeah.
And the other possibility is to say, all right, look, let's agree that the the outer and the inner are separate, but nevertheless, we can come up with some way in which perception tells us what's going on the inside. Right?
Yeah.
So you might, for example, think that perception actually all involves inference, and that actually when you perceive the world around you, there are always inferences going on.
Mhm.
You infer the shapes and sizes of things. You infer that the things that you look at have backs. Um, uh, so do you see the thing in front of you as a three-dimensional object? Well, yes, but seeing it as a three-dimensional object also involves your brain constructing
Yeah.
from the image
Yeah.
stuff that isn't present in a two-dimensional image.
Mm.
So in the case of other minds, in the case of perception, you might want to run a line that's similar to that. So the thought is that in each of these cases, you identify the means, you dissipate or overcome obstacles to knowing by those means, and then you ask the third question. You get to level 3, and so you say, well, look, supposing everything you've said so far is true, it is possible to acquire knowledge in these ways by these means. What makes it possible? Right? What else must be the case
Yeah.
for knowledge to be acquirable in that way? What are the background enabling conditions that make it possible, right, for you to acquire knowledge in this way? And the background enabling conditions are going to be all many different sorts. Some of them are going to be background physical or physiological conditions.
Yeah.
So I mean, one thing that you might think is that, look, for human beings to acquire perceptual knowledge in the way that they acquire it, their brains have to have certain capacities, certain dimensions. That has to have a certain processing power. Right? So those are going to be examples of background enabling conditions for for knowing. I mean, those are not the sorts of conditions that Kant was interested in, but that's an example of a background enabling condition for
Yeah.
acquiring knowledge by a particular means.
Okay. And so, you mentioned that in the book, you mentioned the explanatory minimalist wants to stop at 2, but how you demonstrate how important it is that we continue on to 3 and we look at these enabling conditions. And so for my audience who, many of whom love transcendental arguments, they're going to say, well, that kind of sounds like you're looking at necessary conditions. You are doing transcendental deductions. Can you help us think through the difference? I love the way you parse out the difference between enabling conditions and a necessary precondition or condition.
Yeah. So the thought is something like this: um, it might be possible to acquire knowledge in a given way, right? And then certain things must be true for you to acquire knowledge in that way,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it doesn't follow that those things being true is a necessary condition for you to have that knowledge at all.
Yeah.
Because there might be other ways of acquiring that knowledge,
Yeah.
right? With their own necessary conditions, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there might be necessary conditions for acquiring knowledge by perception, necessary conditions for acquiring knowledge by testimony, necessary conditions for acquiring knowledge, by empathy or whatever one comes up with. And so you don't have this idea of general necessary conditions for empirical or a priori knowledge, which is what Kant was after. I mean, the other thing that I did try to emphasize in the book is that if your question is how is knowledge of such and such a kind possible, what I need to do is simply to explain to you how that kind of knowledge is possible.
Yeah.
And I do that by showing you, by giving you means by which it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
But the means by which something is possible don't have to be necessary conditions for its possibility, right? Because there might be more than one means by which something is possible.
Yeah.
So the focus on necessary conditions seems a little bit odd if your starting point is how is such and such a thing possible. I mean, the necessary conditions for knowing. I mean, goodness, that's a tough one, right? I mean, who knows what they are?
Yeah. Yeah.
But we certainly are able to identify various means by which knowledge is possible, and we're able to deal with specific obstacles to knowing by those means. That's what happens in philosophy 101 classes, right? So, but if somebody says, "Oh, but you haven't really answered the question unless you have some completely general account of the necessary conditions under which knowledge is possible, such that knowledge wouldn't be possible at all without those conditions." I mean, that's a really tough one, right? I mean, the obvious one is, well, there wouldn't be knowledge if there aren't subjects of knowledge. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that would be an example of a necessary condition. That's the Cartesian cogito, right? So Descartes thought, in effect, my existence is a necessary condition for me. Is a necessary condition for me to think, and that seems right.
Yeah.
But Kant wanted something a bit more ambitious and substantive than that, and that's much more problematic, I think.
You keep anticipating all my questions, which is great. I was going to bring up the cogito as well, but so for those who might be getting lost real quick, you give this example again and again. It's really helpful, concrete example of traveling from London to Paris. And I forgot the time, and I'm American swine, so I actually don't know how close those two. I think they're pretty close. But you talk about traveling on a railway, I think. Yeah. And can you help us with this concrete example of a difference between necessary conditions and yours?
Yeah. So supposing I run into a friend in central London, right, and they say, I need to be in Paris in 3 hours. How is that possible? Right. So I say to them, look, hop on the Eurostar. Right. The Eurostar will get you to Paris in 2.5 hours. Okay. So what have I done? They've asked me a how possible question. Right. So for them, they ask the question in that form because they can't see how they can make it to their dinner reservation in 3 hours' time. Right. Seems like really difficult.
There's an obstacle. Yeah.
Yeah. There's an obstacle. Right. the clock is ticking. Okay, so what have I done? I've shown them, I've given them, I've offered them a means of getting from London to Paris in under 3 hours. Get the Eurostar, right? Now, is catching the Eurostar a necessary condition for getting from London to Paris in 3 hours? Well, no, right? You could also get from London to Paris in under 3 hours by catching a plane.
Yeah.
Right. So, supposing somebody said, okay, so you've got a plane and a train together. Are they jointly? Do they exhaust the possibilities? Well, no, right? I mean, for all I know, Elon Musk has a rocket that could do it in
Right.
under 3 hours, right? I mean, in a way, that's all completely irrelevant, right? You don't want to know, if you ask me how is it possible to do this, you don't want to know whether the way I'm telling you is the only way to
Right.
do it. What you want to know is it a way of doing it, a way of doing it that's available to me right now?
Yeah.
Okay, so catching the Eurostar is a means of doing it. And if you say to me, supposing you had no idea, supposing you've just woken up from a long sleep, and you say to me, "What is the Eurostar?" And I say to you, "Well, it's a train." And you say to me, "I don't really get it. How can a train get from London to Paris? Isn't there like the English Channel? Isn't there like 17 miles of water between Britain and Europe?" So I say to you, "Okay, here's a piece of news for you. There's a tunnel, right, that goes under the ocean." Okay, so what would previously have been an insuperable obstacle to getting from London to Paris by train is no longer an insuperable obstacle. Right, so now I've dealt with the obstacle. Right? I've recognized the obstacle as in a sense genuine, right? Because relative to your assumption that trains can't go on water, that looks like a real obstacle. But I've dealt with the obstacle by saying, "Oh, there's a tunnel." Okay. Now you might say to me, "But what makes it possible for me to get from London to Paris in a tunnel? What are the enabling conditions for that?" Well, I mean, the enabling conditions for that are that, well, we human beings have the technology to drill under the ocean and build the tunnel, right? So there's a whole mass of technical or technological enabling conditions
Yeah.
for this journey. So there you have the three stages, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've got the initial question. Then I've answered the question by giving you means. I've dealt with an obstacle to those means, and I've said something about the conditions under which means like that are means for achieving what you want to achieve. But at no point in our conversation have I said anything about necessary conditions. Right? And if you say to me, "How do I get from London to Paris in 3 hours?" And if I say to you, "Well, now let's sit and think about the necessary conditions for doing that," right, you'd probably think I'd lost my mind. Right? And
Right.
you probably think, "I've got a dinner date in 3 hours, right? I don't want to sit here and discuss with you what are the necessary conditions for doing it. I want to know, how do you do it, right?
Yeah.
Tell me how I can now do it."
Yeah.
And I've told you, I catch the Eurostar.
Yeah, I think that was such an interesting point to draw out, because you might say, well, uh, if you're looking from a transcendental argument perspective and you're looking for necessary conditions, well, a necessary condition of you going from London to Paris is that you exist. So now we have to talk, and it's so broad as to be just not helpful in this context.
Yeah. So if you're worrying that the clock is ticking and that you're kind of late for your appointment, and I say to you, "Listen, I've got some really exciting news for you. I've identified a necessary condition for you to get from London to Paris in 3 hours, and the necessary condition is you exist." Right? Well, true, but supremely unhelpful.
Yeah.
And it's just not what you're after, right? What
Right.
you're after is means, and the means need to work. They don't need to be unique. They don't have to be exclusive, right? And this
Mhm.
deals with something else that's kind of quite important. That I mean, of course, in this particular example, the means that I identify are, of course, going to be the means that are available relative to the way the world is now, relative to a
Yeah.
technology as it is now. But I mean, 100 years time, if any of us still exists, there may be completely other means of getting from London to Paris, right?
Yeah.
So in under 3 hours. So
Mm.
um, no one can say for sure that even if they list all the means that we can think of, that those are going to be that's going to be a complete list. So you can't then say it's a necessary condition that you use one of these listed means,
Yeah.
because there may be others that we haven't thought of.
I'm still holding out for thought teleportation. So we'll see if that comes
Right.
around.
Yeah. Well, exactly. Right. So if that, if Star Trek ever comes true, right,
Hmm.
then there's going to be lots of other possibilities.
Right.
You can just step into the teletransporter.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, Dr. Kassam, are enabling conditions then, are they picking out sufficient conditions then, not or is it something altogether different from necessary and sufficient?
I think they just enable. I just don't find it helpful to think in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. They're just
Okay.
there is conditions, the fulfillment of which make something possible. Right?
Okay.
So the existence of the of the Channel Tunnel is an enabling condition for you to catch a train from London to Paris.
Hmm.
That seems right.
Okay.
It's what enables you to do it. But is the existence of the Channel Tunnel a necessary condition for you to get from London to Paris? Well, no, right? There are lots of
Right.
other ways of doing it. Is it a necessary condition for you to do it by train? Well, yeah, at the moment, right? But who's to say that one day they won't build a bridge, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So saying that that the fulfillment of certain conditions enable you to do such and such a thing is different from saying you couldn't do it. It's different from saying that such a thing wouldn't be possible if those
Right.
conditions were not fulfilled.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful. So getting back to the problem of other minds, I wore one of my favorite shirts for you here. Do androids dream of electric sheep?
Right.
And
Yes.
uh, and
Yes.
and just the idea of you talk about this in the book, but the idea of zombies and for the idea of philosophical zombies is very weird for people on the outside who haven't thought about this, and for some people on the inside as well. But I think the problem of strong AI or artificial general intelligence, as they call it now, kind of can help motivate this problem of philosophical zombies. Um, what that seems like an obstacle. How is that obstacle overcome in the problem of other minds? How do we how do we overcome that? You might be a sophisticated android.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I really addressed this problem adequately, or indeed at all, in the book. And
Mhm.
what I think about it now is kind of somewhat different.
Okay.
So, um, so one way in which we acquire knowledge is by something called inference to the best explanation.
Hmm.
So you have a range of different explanations, and we pick the one that's the best one, and we need to say what makes the best. But
Yeah.
it's a way of acquiring knowledge. So I mean, so if the question arises, well, what assurance do I have that you have an inner life that's anything like my inner life, that you feel pain, if someone steps on your toe, do you feel pain? Well, the assurance that I have is that, well, physiologically, you're very similar to me. You're a human animal. You have a brain. You have a central nervous system. Does that mean that it's logically impossible for you to
Mhm.
have no inner life? Well, it's not logically impossible, but the best explanation is that human beings have these shared um, psychological characteristics. That's not skeptic proof, right? So
Right.
if you're trying to argue with a skeptic about other minds, then that's not an answer. But I don't really think we should be worrying too much about other minds skepticism of the traditional philosophical form. I mean, the thing that strikes me now is very odd is that when philosophers talk about the problem of other minds, they mean, how do you know, or how can you be sure that other human beings have inner lives?
Right.
That's not the problem of other minds. The real problem of other minds is it really pertains to other animals
Mm.
and to other beings. Right. So if you think about social robots, um, do sophisticated social robots have minds? Well, that's a really kind of interesting, and substantive question.
Hmm.
Or if you think about other creatures like bats or an octopus, right? Now in that case, I mean, it seems to me to be overwhelmingly plausible to say that there's mentality of some sort there, but it's mentality of a sort that is utterly different
Yeah.
from ours. So our ability to grasp what is going on in the mind of an octopus is severely limited, right? Because
Yeah.
their physiology is utterly different from ours. Now, those are real questions. So if you're thinking about, the morality of eating meat, for example,
Yeah.
of killing cows, and for beef, I mean, clearly a lot hangs on whether you think they have mentality, and if they do, what kind of mentality they have. Right. So
Yeah.
if you think that they have sophisticated mental lives, that they form bonds with other cows, that they are capable of suffering, of pain, of pity, of fear, the morality of killing these creatures to eat them is going to look very different from if you think that they don't have mental lives, or their mental lives are much more primitive.
Yeah, and the
Than
method, yeah, and the method used to
yeah,
kill them as well, if that's something that you decide to do. So, in describing mentality here, do you have something stronger in mind than just consciousness? Because you think of Nagel's 1974 paper. Is there something it's like to be a bat? Certainly, they're conscious. I think most of us would want to say yes, they're conscious, and yes, it was fantastic of him to pick a bat because it's so different than us, but
yeah,
similar. But mentality, you're saying something above and beyond just the baseline of
yeah.
conscious.
Well, yes. I mean, the fact that a creature has that baseline consciousness is certainly of some relevance to
Sure.
how we treat it. But certainly, if you're thinking about higher animals, I mean, what's striking is that they have actually very sophisticated
Yeah.
mental lives. I mean, so I live in the UK in a sort of farming area, and so in the fields around where I'm speaking to you from right now are sheep and cows and horses, and because they're right outside my window, of course I have the opportunity to observe them. And when you observe them, and in particular if you get to know some of these animals, you realize that they are incredibly sophisticated.
Yeah.
That they have very complex mental lives, and they live as there are social structures. So
Yeah.
if there are cows that get on well with other cows, that have friends within the group. There are all sorts of
Different like
bonds that
personalities,
are,
right?
yeah, they have
Yeah.
personalities. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, anyone who's watching this show who has even a pet will
Right.
know that of course they have personalities,
Mm.
right? So you have seemingly very sophisticated mentality in those cases, and I think the interesting question there is why is not really, well, how do we know that that's true? The traditional skeptical question. The more interesting question is, why does it seem so compelling to us and so unavoidable now to attribute
Mm.
fairly sophisticated mentality to a lot of creatures other than human beings?
Yeah.
Right? And where do we draw the line between those cases where we are really quite comfortable attributing mentality to more problematic cases, right?
Yeah.
So then you get into questions about robots and AI and all that,
Right. Right.
and of course these are really interesting questions,
Yeah.
and these are real questions. These are not made up questions for a philosophy class, right? These are questions that the answers to which actually are hugely significant, both practically and ethically.
Yeah, I love that you made that point as well because well, as they get closer to AGI or strong AI, as Cyril calls it, we're gonna have to make some decisions here about turning them off or not turning them off, or
Yeah,
attributing human rights to them, or maybe broadening our category from human to biological or certain level of sentience.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I always like to refer people to Locke, actually, in this
okay.
case. So John Locke, English philosopher, 17th century, famously defines a person as a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection
Mhm.
and can consider itself as itself, the
Yeah.
same thinking being in different times and different places. Now, what's really striking about this definition is that the word human being doesn't figure.
Hmm.
Right? So Locke isn't saying that a person has got to be a human being.
Yeah.
What Locke's view is that any being that has these mental capacities is a person,
Yeah.
and therefore has certain, to put it crudely, certain rights. We have certain obligations towards it. So for Locke, if a parrot convinced us that it has these capacities, then a parrot would be a person.
Because
And it's
personhood
not
is up
even,
here. Yeah, personhood can be
it's
instantiated in human personhood,
exactly,
but it can be
exactly.
that. That sounds like Peter Strawson as well.
Yeah, well, yes. Now, Strawson is interesting on this question because he um, never really addresses the Lockean point in a direct way. I mean, Strawson tends to assume that persons have got to be embodied beings. I think that's the
Okay,
minimum condition. So
that's right,
persons have got to have bodies.
and that's
It's
against the
not
Cartesian dualism. He
against the Cartesian
sure,
dualism. It's
sure.
not clear whether he thinks or whether he's committed to the view that the bodies have to be human bodies or even animal bodies, right? So if you think
Okay,
of the movie RoboCop, right?
yeah,
Uh, so this guy, his body parts are gradually are replaced by prosthetics of one sort or another. Right? So is that a person? Right? So on a Lockean from a Lockean perspective, the answer would be plainly yes, right? Because as long as you've got something that has the mental capacities, you've got a person.
yeah,
And of course, if you're religious and you believe in God, well, you presume you believe God is a person, right? I mean, in traditional Christian theology, God is a
yeah.
person, but God
And
is certainly not a
angels,
human
sure,
being and not an animal, right?
right,
And not a
right,
machine, right? So, and that's it's something else that was at the back of Locke's mind, right? That he doesn't want to define personhood in a way that limits it to human beings or to any one type of creature.
hmm
And that seems to me now, I mean, I don't talk about this in the possibility of knowledge, but that seems to me now to be a very important insight. And it's important because it leaves open the possibility that personhood could, in principle, be extended to, for example, dolphins or whales or chimpanzees, or, of course, to sophisticated robots. Right? There's nothing in the definition that rules that out. The question for Locke would be: do these creatures have these capacities? Are they thinking intelligent beings? Are they self-aware? Do they have the sense of themselves as existing through time and in different places? If
yeah.
they have all of those things, then you are dealing with a person in those cases.
Yeah, and I haven't got a chance to look at your book on self knowledge yet. Self knowledge for human persons or for
Yeah,
human beings,
humans. Yeah, yeah,
humans. I'm really excited for that too because I think that and like the self awareness, kind of self consciousness, is such a fascinating and important subject. The self conscious, because if a bat's conscious, that's really interesting. That's cool. But I don't think a lot of us would attribute self consciousness to
yeah,
a bat in that same
yeah,
higher level
yeah.
personhood regard.
Yeah, so this is a fascinating topic. I mean, for Locke, self-awareness or self-consciousness is fundamental to personhood,
Yeah.
right? It's a very important element of his definition. And then you get into all sorts of interesting questions about, well, okay, but how sophisticated does the self-awareness need to be? Right? So if you have a cat, right? I mean, so if you have a cat and you see the cat in front of a mirror, right? I mean, it's not clear that the cat recognizes itself
Right.
in the mirror, right? So in that sense, the cat fails the mirror test on self-awareness, right?
Mhm.
Whereas we, at a certain age, pass that test. So
Yeah.
so that's one element of self-awareness. But of course, there's a whole lot more to self-awareness. And going back to Kant, of course, in the Critique of Pure Reason, one of the central part, the central chapter of the Critique of Pure Reason, the transcendental deduction of the categories, is a chapter in which he essentially develops a theory of self-awareness,
Yeah.
a kind of an account of what it is to be aware of oneself in this sense. And Kant has a very demanding view of self-awareness, on which non-human animals are not going to come out as self-aware in his sense.
Mhm.
But that might just be a reason for rejecting Kant's account, or just pointing out how restricted it is and saying, well, actually, if you're thinking about morally significant self awareness, we don't need or shouldn't restrict it to the sorts of things that Kant is talking about.
Yeah. And we're downstream from him, so we have lots more to go on. We have him to go on. We can stand on his shoulders, even as we have empirical evidence that's brand new to us about octopi and or
Yeah,
octopuses. I don't know the plural of them, but yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, exactly. So we should bear in mind what we know now, which Kant didn't know,
Mhm.
which is a hell of a lot.
That's right.
And this has a huge bearing on how we think about all sorts of all sorts of philosophical issues. So I mean, just as just to kind of go back to the question that you asked about the problem of other minds.
Hmm.
I guess what I'm saying is that I'm not really, this is speaking for myself. I'm just not exercised by the problem of other minds
Hmm.
in the form that philosophers traditionally have been worrying about, which is
Yeah.
about other human beings. I think there is a problem of other mind, but it's a problem that I just don't have any concerns about whether you have a mind, right?
Yeah.
I'm very, very, very confident that you do.
Yeah, I
You
probably
know,
have qualia experiences and such.
yeah, and you have thoughts and fears and ambitions and hopes and all this stuff,
Hmm.
right? I mean, I don't know you that well, but I would be willing to bet a hell of a lot of money
Yeah.
on all of those things being true of you, just as I'm sure you would bet a lot of money on those things being true of me. So I just don't think that this is stuff that we should be concerned about. But if somebody asks me about well, what do we know about the mind of an octopus? Right? Should we be eating these creatures? Well, those are really good questions, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, the most recent evidence I've seen suggests that these are unbelievably sophisticated creatures with highly sophisticated mentality that's
Yeah.
very different from ours.
Yeah, likewise with like cuttlefish, and you see the patterns that they display, and it looks like an alien creature. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the capacities view, I really want to go in for, but it freaks me out a little bit because, as you said, there's a certain point before which the human baby or the human child will not pass the mirror test,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I don't want to say that that's less of a
Mm,
person. Maybe it is, and maybe they still have human rights, even though
mm,
they're not quite a person yet. And like you
mm,
said, also
mm.
there's other conditions that need to be met for personhood, not just
Yeah.
the awareness thing.
Yeah. 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 So that's a really great point. I mean, it suggests that Locke's conditions are in one sense too demanding. I
Hmm.
mean, Locke is really interesting because in a way he's very charitable, right? So he's charitable in the sense that he allows non-humans to
Right.
count as persons, right? But in another way, he's very uncharitable because it looks as though, on Locke's view, not all humans are going
Right.
to count as persons.
Right.
Right? So
Right.
a newborn baby is not yet a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and self-awareness. So that's not a person.
Right.
Or if you think of someone at the opposite end of life, someone with in advanced dementia, or someone in a coma, irreversible coma, that doesn't seem to be a person by Locke's definition. So Locke is going to have to do a bit of fancy footwork to deal with those examples, right? So they might say, well, look, in the case of a baby, it's the fact that it has the capacity to develop these capacities
Yeah.
that makes it a person. And in the
Like the
case of the
potential.
person,
Yeah.
yeah, so there's potentiality.
Hmm.
Um, um, Whereas the person at the end of life is still a person because they had those capacities and they just happen to have lost them. And then the worry is, well, isn't this now all a bit ad hoc?
Yeah.
So maybe that's a worry, maybe it's not a worry. And of course, certainly if you're thinking about all these debates in the US about abortion, for
Yep.
example, is the fetus a person? Well, no, not by Locke's lights.
Hmm.
Right? The fetus is a human, but not a person because it doesn't have these capacities. But again, you could run the same line, right? Which is that it's a creature, it's a being such that in the normal course of events, it will develop these capacities.
Right.
Right? So there are various sort of adjustments that you can make to Locke's account of personhood, which continue to place mental capacities at the center of personhood,
Yeah.
but without having these rather uncomfortable conclusions about vast numbers of human beings not being persons.
Yeah. So this the problem of other minds is really interesting. I think that the philosophical zombie case, I'm not worried about it, but I think it may be interesting as an argument against like certain types of philosophy of mind, conceptions of philosophy of mind, like machine functionalism or something
Yeah,
like that, identity theory maybe.
yeah.
Um, do you just a couple random questions for you here as we close up? What do you make of like machine functionalism and strong AI or AGI? Do you think that that's I think it's probably logically possible, but do you think that it's metaphysically possible? Do you think it's going to happen that robots will have first-person perspective like us?
Um, I I just don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't see a reason to rule it out at some
Okay.
point in the future. But I don't know. I think it's just one of these things that time will tell.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. And then when I'm used to the language of analogy. So I think of like Alvin Planning as God and other minds. When he's thinking about other minds, he says, "Well, I'm making an argument by analogy from my own first person perspective to someone else." Is that what you're getting at with the when you describe the inferential model? Is that the same kind of thing, an argument by analogy, or something different?
It doesn't. I think it's something different. I mean, so if I infer that you have a mind on the basis of the fact that you have a nervous system and a brain that is
Oh
of
yeah,
the
sure,
appropriate dimensions, then that's not an argument by analogy, right? But it's still
sure.
inference to the best. It's still inference to the best explanation. Right? So
Okay.
um, I think the inference to the best explanation is in a way the most fundamental. I mean, if somebody
Okay.
if in the real world, if somebody actually challenges you, right, about these sorts of issues, I don't know what more you could do other than to point out, look, we're dealing with a human being here. We're dealing with a
Yeah.
human animal. We're dealing with something that has the right kind of brain, the right kind of central nervous system, that has the right kind of sensory apparatus, right?
Yeah.
So why are you worrying about whether this thing actually has a mind, right?
Yeah.
What's the worry? What's the
Yeah.
concern?
I think that's a great point. So I think it's Peter Lipton wrote the book on inference, the best explanation. And when in reading that, it was so apparent to me that this is what we do all the time. If I look in the
Yeah,
fridge and I don't see a piece of pizza that I
yeah,
was expecting to see, I'm going to
yeah,
infer that probably my wife ate it and not that a
yeah.
philosophical zombie came and ate it, but didn't have any quality experience of it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Lipton and I were briefly colleagues in
Oh,
Cambridge. He's
wow.
now dead, and he's a lovely man. I mean,
Yeah.
a really cool guy. And you're right. I mean, this stuff is really good and really important, and underappreciated, I think.
Yeah. And so one last thing, because we did mention the cogito. Um, I think it's like Adrian Barden maybe says that the cogito is a successful world-directed transcendental argument. So kind of
Yeah.
he says it evades Stroud's critique
Yeah.
or bifurcation there.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on the cogito? Is it a successful transcendental argument?
Well, I think it is, but it doesn't tell us that much. I
Right.
mean, so yes, in order for me to think, I must exist. So that seems right. But of course, what Descartes was interested in was the nature of my existence. What kind of thing am I?
Sure.
And I don't think um, you can establish what Descartes thought he could establish
Yep.
by the cogito argument.
Like he was getting at substance dualism, that he's a essentially
Yeah.
a thinking substance.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Right. So the eye is immaterial and independent of the body, and so on and so forth. Well, you can't establish any of that using
Yeah.
this mode of argumentation. But I think the thing about the cogito is interesting because it doesn't really get mentioned that much, at least as far as I know, in the literature on transcendental arguments. But it's a
Right.
very kind of obvious one to go for, right?
I think so. It's the most immediate one as well. Like
Yeah,
I'm right here
yeah,
thinking, I'm doing this stuff, and
yeah.
I think it is successful because I really like transcendental arguments. Not that I think there's a bunch of successful ones. I just think it's super
Mm,
interesting, and
mm,
your work as well. These kind of things, how possible questions are the most fascinating to me.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
but yeah, like people kind of just concede that Stroud. Just I think Robert Stern's kind of been beat down by him over the years, and
Mm,
he was kind of the
mm,
flag bearer, and everyone's like, okay, well, Strawson was wrong, and Stern is now with his tail between his legs, so Stroud won. But then along comes Adrian Barton. He said, well, wait a second, like Descartes was here the whole time, and that seemed successful. But again, people
yeah.
wave that one away, and they say it's totally fallacious and it's
Yeah.
bad reasoning.
Yeah, well, so I think there are two issues. I mean, one is whether it's fallacious or not, and the other is whether it establishes substantive conclusions. So
Sure,
I think the critic of transcendental arguments might say, well, even if this argument works, it doesn't establish anything substantive. It
sure.
establishes that I exist, but it
Yep.
doesn't tell us anything about the nature of this I. Whereas transcendental arguments are attempts to establish substantive conclusions about
Mm,
reality by reflecting on the necessary conditions for the possibility of experience. And that's something that Descartes has not done and which
sure.
can't be done. So that's I think what you would say if you were trying to respond to this style of argumentation.
Okay. See, that's why I like you as a thinker so much because that was so clear. That seems so right that it doesn't seem like you have an axe to grind. You're just looking at it and you're saying, hey, these guys not quite. These guys, I really appreciate that. That's what I love about this book. That's why I made you talk about this one. Dr. Kassam, as we close up here, you have a new book coming out. Can you quickly pitch that and where people might be able to find that?
Yeah, so my philosophical interests have changed completely. I now do much more applied philosophy, and my new book is called Extremism: A Philosophical Analysis, and it's going to be published in September this year. And it's an attempt to use my sort of philosophical thinking to address a real world, immediate, urgent problem. What
Mm,
is extremism? Is it a bad thing? What do we do about it? Why do people become extremists? So it's a combination of philosophy, politics, and psychology, I
yeah.
guess. So September, and I think it's on Amazon as we speak.
Okay, awesome. And you've also done recent work on conspiracy theories, and so
Yeah,
you're kind of someone that I like to point to when people say, "Hey, you're talking about philosophical zombies and other minds and all this." That's what philosophy is. And you go, "Wait a second, Dr. Kassam here is working on
yes,
immediate stuff that could impact your life today about terrorism,
yeah,
or your
yes,
grandma or your aunt at the party talking about conspiracy theories." So I do
yeah.
appreciate that you're able to do both.
Well, I mean, I think that I did a lot of very abstract theoretical philosophy when I started out. But as I get older, I feel greater and greater urgency to apply whatever skills I have to real world, immediate pressing problems,
Yeah,
and that's what I intend to do for the rest of my career, I guess.
yeah. Well, awesome. Thanks again for all of your time. This conversation could go forever. The book is fantastic. Again, I really recommend it, even though it's older now. It's still fantastic. The Possibility of Knowledge by Dr. Quassim Cassam. It's an Oxford book, and hopefully we can have him back on. We can talk about more of his work. He's had a bunch of work, which I find fascinating. But for now, that's going to have to do it. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.